We are moving on to our keynote session on story study lesson, data as a tool for climate campaigning. Leading this session will be Ms. Serena Bashal, Youth Environmental Engagement Coordinator at UNICEF. Let's give Serena a warm round of virtual applause. And Serena, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Really nice to see you all. So yeah, this is going to be the UNICEF session. And so I often like to, when I do these sessions with YACAP, and I like to kind of do different collaborations and bring in other teams from UNICEF so we can talk about different topics. And so today for this session, we're collaborating with the digital team, and we have this really exciting session planned, and it's a bit different actually to the kind of topics I usually do. So we're going to be talking a bit about how you can all use data and innovative thinking and innovative approaches and this kind of evidence and this hard evidence to back up your advocacy and make your advocacy very strong. Because you know, when if you're lobbying someone or like a government person, or you're doing any form of advocacy, when you can back up your points with such strong solid evidence and data and all of this, it just makes it so much more powerful and have such a high impact, and you can really like get into the minds of people with your information that you're pushing forward. And so yeah, really happy to be delivering this session today. And so let's just crack on. So it's really now with my pleasure to introduce my colleague Ant, who has just come on screen now. And so yeah, just waving at you now. So Anthony's going to take you through some notes and his presentation and some information. I've already gone over it as well. It's absolutely fascinating. So really excited to hear more about it. So yeah, Anthony, over to you.
Thanks, Serena. Thanks for the warm welcome. G'day, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Anthony, and I'm a data scientist at the UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office. But before that, I used to be a climate activist. So I'm going to share with you today a thing I've called Story Study Lesson. It's a little bit of a story about a climate campaign that I think is a really good example of data as a tactic sitting inside the strategy. Going to talk a little bit about like what we can extract from it, and then depending on how we're going, maybe a bit of workshop or maybe just some questions to take home and think about, like, where can I use this kind of data in my campaign? And now I am going to attempt a screen share, which is usually death. All right, you guys looking at my whole screen?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's start with a story. And this is the story of how a tiny climate org with no huge amount of resources. Damn it. Try that again. Okay, so this is the story of how a tiny climate org with no huge amount of resources figured out how to use data to win their campaign. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the timeline. Just before I start, one or two disclaimers. So in most of these slides, I've used data sourced from a United Nations source where possible. In a couple of cases, I've used data from the climate org themselves. With the exception of the data that I'm going to introduce at the end around the CCRIs, the Children's Climate Risk Index, I'm not specifically endorsing any of this data as for use in one of your campaigns, except for the CCRIs. And on that long disclaimer, when you're coming up with a climate tactic, it's really good to keep in mind that often the best data for your campaign is the data that your campaigns already trust. So with that, I'm going to tell you the story. So here it is. It's 2016. And there's 1,553 gigawatt hours of new coal projects that have just been approved this year. Coal is cheap, it's plentiful, it's one of the most CO2 emitting sources. Same year. One person climate campaign that started in Australia gets a small private grant to explore innovative ways of avoiding catastrophic climate change. And so with a tiny team and their tiny grant, they start working with some other campaigners to build a map of like, what are the most exciting, innovative, interesting areas that we could work on in climate change? And the three that they come up with, oh yeah, sure. Uh, and the three that they come up with, the most interesting, innovative ideas they can think of are what about insurance, spreadsheets, and LinkedIn? So through the course of 2016, 2017, they start with those three tools and begin producing an annual report card. And while creating a really strong distributed network of campaigners, focusing on the insurance industry and particularly the business of reinsurance, which is coal mines need insurers in order to get started. Coal, we know, has like huge environmental and economic consequences, but right now the coal miners don't always necessarily bear the full brunt of those costs. So armed with that, they started trying to talk to their insurance colleagues about what would it take to start treating coal as the risk we think it is. And they started with data. What do we know about these insurance companies? Which of them have a coal divestment policy? Which of them have another fossil fuels divestment policy? And from that, they created a scorecard. And these scorecards, which are super simple examples of data and data visualization, were incredibly powerful. They got picked up by people in the insurance industry, they got picked up by other climate campaigners, and they got picked up by the press. And the thing that it worked, the reason it worked, is it created a race to the top where there was no insurance company who wanted to be seen to be ignoring the climate risk. And whilst they have ESG and corporate social responsibility, this was a really tangible part of their business where they were able to help hold them to account for walking the talk of their own CSG. So fast forward, June 2021. They're making some progress, they're building momentum, they're spurring competition, and then this happens. The UN Secretary General, appearing at an international insurance conference, says, this campaign is right. You guys need to get your act together, follow suit, and figure out how we can create the right kind of reinsurance for coal. So that brings us to today. How did the campaign do? Well, from 2016, with 1,500 gigawatts-ish of new coal projects approved, as the campaign's 5 years wound up, it's dropped by 2/3. At the same time, there were absolutely zero insurers who had a coal exit policy when this campaign started. At the end, almost 2/3 now have a plan to either divest from coal or have a plan for an exit strategy. Okay, cool story, needs more dragons. Why did it work? I wish we had 6 hours because I would love to talk about some of these other building blocks around getting how they got a grip on the context, how they understood the problem and issue. But for the purpose of this, I'm just going to talk about a good theory of change and a good job of identifying where the power lay in terms of allies and advocates. And then lastly, I'll talk about data as a tactic. So theory of change. For those of you who've done like climate campaigner trainings in the past, you may have encountered this. This is a standard formula that I stole from Marshall Gans at the Harvard Kennedy School for how to figure out if what you're proposing to change the world is in fact a theory of change. And it goes, if we do tactic, then strategic goal, because reasons. And I've had a go at creating my best paraphrase of the Sunrise Project, which is, if we get climate risk into insurance models, then more carbon will stay in the ground because it'll become economic to produce certain coal projects, because coal miners don't currently bear the true cost of their economic impact. So armed with that pretty solid theory of change, if we raise the costs of this, then we may get less of it. They started with some power mapping, understanding who are the players, who could we potentially target as both an ally, but also as a direction for our tactic. And they did a power map. So this is my recreation of their power map. I couldn't find the real thing. If you guys have experienced these before, this is essentially just get a big board, draw a big cross in the middle, and start putting sticky notes on for everyone you can think of who is involved in the issue, has some degree of influence and some degree of alignment, like they have an opinion one way or the other. So this was where the world started for the Sunrise Project campaign, where they identified fellow climate campaigners as obviously super aligned, but not necessarily having that much influence over whether a new coal project gets built. They also identified these guys in the middle who are often gold, which is they have some degree of alignment in that they have an opinion about the issue, but maybe not too strong on either side, but a ton of influence. And the reason this campaign worked, most good campaigns, is by moving these actors up and to the right. Do I have cool animation for that? Yeah. So the way you validate your theory of change is, if we do this tactic, will this happen? Will we get climate campaigners have more influence, insurers have more alignment? And finally, the tactic. Data's the tactic. So they took this data, which was kind of complex and hard to understand at a glance, and they turned it into simple, beautiful visualizations that were really easy to share. They used the data to create that race to the top, that competition between insurers who care a lot about this issue and also care a lot about their reputation, and made it a concrete thing that they could do in order to improve both of those. I really like the way they've used data as storytelling here. So in each year's report, you can see who's moving up, who's moving down, who's doing more, who's doing less. And they used one final cool data tactic, which was micro-targeting. And in this, because of a good distributed network of campaigners, they had lots of local campaigns in, I think, 30-ish countries in the world. And using those local campaigners, they ran a adopt a insurer campaign, and they would just find relevant people in the insurance industry on LinkedIn, friend them on LinkedIn, and start talking to them about these climate issues, using the data tactic, using this scorecard as the entry point for those conversations. Okay, so how can we apply this in some of our climate campaigns, yours more than mine these days? For that, I want to present you with a cool fact. There is a data set right now that I think has many of the same good properties as the scorecard data from the Sunrise Project. It's exclusively focused on climate, and it's called the Children's Climate Risk Index. Sorry, team, just one.
Anthony? Anthony, can you hear us?
Hey guys,
Can anyone hear
sorry,
me?
my internet just cut out.
Okay.
My internet just cut out for a sec. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now.
Cool. So there's a data set that has a lot of those same properties. It's the Children's Climate Risk Index. It's a data product authored by the UN. It's based on a number of high-resolution data sets, but nearly all of them endorsed either by a United Nations partner or by national governments themselves. And it does the same trick. It takes these 47 high-res data sets, which are about diverse topics like flood risk, drought risk, dengue risk. It boils them down into 12 child-centered indicators. It turns those into just two key pillars that help to focus what's the hazard and what's the vulnerability. And finally, you end up with one number. This is available for nearly every country in the world right now, and it's the Children's Climate Risk Index. So I really like this data set. I think it's one of these ways where people are trying to take data that's sometimes pretty complex and hard to grok and distill it into something that's ready for activism, ready for action. And this is the best example I know of. I don't know if you guys have had a talk before from anyone from UNICEF about the Children's Climate Risk Indicators, but it's super good work. It has those properties of being the data that your campaign targets and allies are already relying on. It's distilled, it's relatively easy to interpret, and it can provide a pointy end for that house. So I've put some links here. I'll paste them in the chat. There's reports available if you'd like to read them that contain a lot of details that are probably not super campaign relevant. But there's also an interactive atlas. You can get the raw data itself to start using it in your own advocacy docs or whatever. And there's also an API if you want to start building apps on top of this to try and highlight, like, from my country, where's it doing well, where's it not doing well, and how can they improve? So I put in a couple of prompt questions, but I'm kind of happy to leave this section open. Also, maybe I'll throw Serena back into the mix with this one too. So I think the ones that occurred to me when I prepared it is, can you see a place for this kind of data-driven tactic in a campaign that you're thinking about? A question about how does it fit into your theory of change, and maybe which campaign target or ally might best respond to this data as a powerful tactic for climate advocacy. And with that, I'll hand back to Serena for the next bit, but keen to hear your thoughts, keen to hear your questions, keen to talk more. Favorite quote to end with: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thanks, guys, and I'll hand back to Serena.
Thank you so much. And as I said at the start, and as I already predicted for everyone, absolutely fascinating. Oh, can you keep that slide 40 up, please? So yeah, thank you so much. And I think we actually will probably finish in like 5 or 10 minutes. And instead of breakout, let's just have an open discussion on this now for 5 or 10 minutes. Can you just move this thing so I can see the questions? Yeah. So I think I'd be really keen to just ask the room. I mean, I know it's a very, very big room. There's 168 of us. So maybe just 1 or 2 people. Would anyone like to, I guess, say a comment or address any of these questions? I guess the first one we can start with. So just thinking about everything that was just presented, looking at the data, and also looking at that example of how data was used in advocacy and the campaign, and it was very successful. Has anyone in this room really, really pushed forward on data? Or are you doing a campaign now that you can see actually there's a really good window here to bring some in? Or just anything you would like to share about this topic? Anthony, I think this is a question for you. Yeah, also feel free to add in any questions instead. How often did you update the database to keep consistency?
It's a good question. So when we're talking about the CCRI, the Children's Climate Risk Indicator, we've done the first one for 2021, and the plan is to do annual or every second year refreshes. Also, because a lot of this data is tied into the SDG indicators, it gets updated through both like the satellite data and those government sources. So when you think about it as an advocacy tool, you're usually going to be using last year's data, but last year's data is practically as good as this year's data when we're talking about big systemic change. I'm sorry, guys, I can't see the chat while I'm full screen sharing. So if you've got comments, maybe call them out.
Serena says smart. Not me, Serena, a different Serena says smart. Yeah, does anyone else have anything to share? I mean, I know that when I'm doing my own advocacy, and you know, when like you're sitting in front of some kind of key stakeholder, and you just throw the most solid data and evidence towards them, and you can see like how it soaks into their head, and how I don't know, maybe some lights flicker in their head where it opens a new perspective that they didn't think of before.
Yeah, and I think the time it can really work is when you're using their own data. That's the campaign tactic that I think is probably the strongest. Is big data source is great. Like big data is my thing. I didn't talk about it much today, but using data that people already trust, I think is a really key one. So like a good one to think about, like the people you're trying to talk to, what data did they already trust, and how can we use that as a campaigning tool?
Yeah, 100%. There is a comment from Tanvir about answering that first question, can I see a place for a data-driven tactic in my campaign? They say number 1, audience targeting, number 2, personalization, number 3, testing and optimization. Would you agree with that, Anne?
Yeah, for sure. I think like those data tactics are often really, all right, I'm going to go back to my house. So there's like every campaign has got a bunch of things to try and solve. When we're talking about trying to build power, I think that kind of targeting is incredibly useful just for identifying who our supporters are, who already agrees with us. And then the second thing is who are our potential targets of our campaign and where can they go with it. Talking about using data for targeting, I think is a great idea. I think there's an awful lot of power you can get from figuring out a key message and using data as the tool to get it in front of the decision makers. So like if you do a Facebook ad, for goodness sake, don't forget to draw a geofence around Parliament House and run it there. Or if you're doing a campaign that targets like particular organizations, then use what you already know in order to improve your targeting on those ones. But also don't dismiss the possibility of using data as itself the tactic, like just letting people know, here's where you stand and here's where you need to be. Would love to talk more about, I guess, like the building power side of using data too, but I tried to keep this one pretty short.
Absolutely. Do you want to just clarify? There was a word there that you said that I don't know what it means. Maybe others. It was, wait, a geofence? Is that what you said?
So if anybody's running Facebook campaigns or like online advertising campaigns, you can often specify the area in which you want this ad to run, and you can micro target those ads super precisely. Like if you've got, I don't know, like a campaign inside your own organization, say like you work for a bank and you want to persuade bank employees, you can not only use the targeting tools that might already exist to craft a message like fellow bank employees, you should join this campaign. You can also specify what geographic area you want it to run in. And those geofences can be quite small. Like you can do that for maybe not quite an individual building, but definitely, you know, a quarter of a suburb where you can be sure that the targets that you're trying to influence are likely to see your ad.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, a couple more comments. So Joseph agrees using data has impact. Caitlin says, good day. I'm Caitlin from Malaysia and I love the presentation. How frequent do you collect the data to have a comparison with data from past years? I think you have slightly touched upon this already, but yeah.
Yeah, so when we're talking about the CCRIs, the index itself, the big number at the top that's available for each country is calculated once a year, and it's kind of based on a rank. One of our climate campaigners would be able to tell you more detail about exactly how these scores get converted into a number. But the baseline data is collected from a lot of like live sources. So things like the satellite data is available more or less in real time. Let me skip my progress lines anymore. So in general, like you can trust that the top number is updated once a year. The underlying data sources, some of them can have a little bit more of a lag, like especially if they rely on something like dengue vaccination. But when international orgs went to the effort of endorsing this, they made a couple of like reasonable trade-offs on what level of data currency they'd accept.
Okay, awesome. Okay, probably have a couple more minutes to address a couple more comments. So there's one here. I think it's more of just a comment. So disaster reports in the Philippines. Keisha, I hope I'm saying your name right. Our local ministry / Department of Environment and Natural Resources for proactive programs and projects, and then the social work ministry for relief response. And so I guess the reports that have come out of this have also been using a lot of data. So Tanvir has addressed another question. How does this all fit into their theory of change? Number 1, for informing program design. Number 2, for tracking progress and monitoring outcomes. And number 3, for evaluating impact. We have a couple of hellos in the chat from Pakistan and Ethiopia. And then you is also saying, talking about collecting data and research. And impact has passed, but things are changing. Very, very true. And Geethika, I have conducted more than 200 campaigns against global warming and the climate crisis, demonstrations in schools, rural areas. Amazing. Okay. So I'm just like reading all the comments now. Okay, there's a big one here from Mikhail. Okay, so incorporating these kind of tactics into a campaign can be very, very effective and help you really better understand your target audience and their needs, and of course, tracking progress and the impact. And in terms of determining how this can all fit into the theory of change, you should consider how you plan to achieve your campaign's goals. The theory of change outlines the steps that would be necessary, and then the data-driven tactics help to identify which steps are working and which ones are not working, and then you can make these adjustments. And then as for which campaign target or ally might respond best to the tactics, it depends on your own specific context and your own goals. Okay, maybe let's take one more question from Prachi and then we can close. So Anthony, what to do to remove the possibility of biasness in data?
This is a really good question, and I think it's related to questions about trust. When we say the data is biased, there's data scientist shorthand. All models are wrong, but some are useful. There's no such thing as a perfect data set. All of these are somewhere between the map and the territory. Like, we could produce an incredible model of global temperature by writing down the temperature on every square meter of the world. That would be super accurate, but not necessarily useful. So whenever we aggregate, there's some loss of the underlying data. And I think sometimes when people talk about bias, what they really mean is trust. That we know that the data is wrong, but for this other data, we understand the ways in which it is wrong, and we understand the directions in which it is wrong. When people say, oh, that data is probably biased, it's often the same thing as saying, I don't trust that you've understood the ways in which it is biased. And comes back a little bit to what I talked about earlier, like finding data sets that are already trusted is the best thing. So somebody was mentioning before, like DSWD in Philippines collect great data. They're rightfully proud of it. They're also extremely suspicious of you coming to them with anybody else's data because they know how painful it was for them to collect it and get it, even half right the first time. And so they don't trust that somebody else is going to do it as well. So I think when you talk about bias, maybe think about trust and what does your campaign target really care about, which is often like provenance of the data, where did it come from, and understanding of the methods, like where is it likely to be wrong and in which direction.
Love that answer. That all makes sense. Very much addressed what the question was. So yeah, I guess with that was the kind of closing comment. And thank you so much, Anthony, for the brilliant presentation. And so yeah, moderators, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Serena and Anthony, for that insightful sharing and for sharing a little bit more and giving us insights, particularly on data and on trust as well.